I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the Cyber Initiative at the Aspen Institute and a contributing editor at Wired. And thank you so much for joining us. This is, subject matter-wise, probably an unfortunate panel to be accidentally co-scheduled against the January 6th hearing, because I imagine if you are sitting here in this room today, you are also interested in the January 6th hearing. So thank you for joining us to talk in person.
Can we put it back up on?
Well, so Emily, Chris's wife, is actually sitting here listening to the whole thing, and she can text us any blockbusters from the hearing that we should announce from the stage. So I'm joined by a really fantastic mix of thinkers in the cyber world and people that I have respected and learned a great deal from over the years. And our goal today is to try to help you all understand the ways that the tech world and the cyber domain have changed in the last 4 months. That for those of us who have been involved in this space, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has seen some really fascinating lessons that we're going to spend some time today talking about, and talking about how that is also changing the way that we think of what the threats and opportunities and possibilities are in the cyber domain going forward. So I want to start this morning with Chris Krebs, or this afternoon with Chris Krebs. Chris, you headed the federal government's civilian cybersecurity agency, CISA, spent a lot of your time in government in the Trump administration thinking about critical infrastructure and what cyber threats could look like to electrical utilities and water companies and manufacturing and communication systems. What has surprised you about what we have seen play out in Ukraine since February and even actually going back into January?
So I think to establish the context for that mindset, I want to go back even a little bit further. So when I came into the Trump administration in 2017, throughout the 2016 election, I was at Microsoft, and we were seeing all this Russian activity centered around the election, coming from various corners. Microsoft saw a good bit of it because a lot of the attacks kind of transited their infrastructure, targeting their systems, using some of their cloud infrastructure. But when I think the full kind of unveiling of what the Russians tried to do in terms of hack and leak campaigns against political campaigns and individuals, the targeting of some of the election equipment throughout the country, I've always described it as kind of a Sputnik moment. And I know that's an overused cliche term, but I do think that there was a bit of a recollection back to 1957. And what was it that was so different about Sputnik? It was not necessarily that the Russians beat us to space. It's the fact that they put that satellite into low Earth orbit, which meant they had an intercontinental ballistic missile, and they had the ability to reach out in 15, 20 minutes or less and touch us here, and the geographic isolation was no longer a safe harbor. I think that was the exact same realization that I had, that a number of us had, and I think the American people had, that cyber attacks had a similar quality, that the internet was then collapsing the space between us, and that you could have this sort of disruptive, destructive, destabilizing attack. And so as I worked through 17, 18, 19, 20 in the run-up to the 2020 election, became very acquainted with Russian capabilities, Chinese capabilities, Iranian, the increasing non-state actor set, including ransomware operators. And so as I was thinking about the potential Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this really, this mindset, or at least that analysis piece, for the specific second or further invasion of Ukraine started really in November as the administration was declassifying. So my thinking was that, look, if they play this one to the hilt, if they do what they're really capable of, it is going to be probably a three-phased operation. They're going to go in, they're going to take out the telecommunications networks. They want to blanket darkness over Ukraine, so they have no command and control of their military. They're blind in the field. They can't communicate to their people. They can't communicate out. And why did we think that? Because we'd seen those sorts of capabilities. Russia used those capabilities. They did it in Ukraine the first time. They did it in Georgia in 2008. And we've seen some destructive capabilities as well on the hard infrastructure side. So going after the grid. In 2016, 2015 and 16, the Russians took down the grid temporarily, but they took down the grid nonetheless in Ukraine. So we know that they had the capabilities, they'd used them before, but if we saw in a modern war, a modern conflict, what could that look like? So a lot of the scenario planners were like, it's gonna be big, it's gonna be highly disruptive and destructive, and everyone needs to get their shields up and ready for it, because we also know that even though if they may be targeting Ukraine specifically, there could be spillover effects in NATO countries in Europe, and there could be spillover effects in the US, particularly if we provide non-lethal aid, we sanction them, and take other steps. But, it's not really how it worked out.
Nilo, one of the things that has become very clear in the last 4 months is the extent to which the participants in modern combat have changed. That, in the past, in American wars and geopolitical wars, American companies participated, but only sort of through the proxy of the federal government, manufacturing weapons or, sort of delivering them to the government to be used in combat. And here what we've actually seen over the last 4 months, 5 months, is that the private sector in some ways has been as much of an independent combatant in Ukraine as the US government or Western governments have been. And I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about how that has unfolded and what we've learned from that.
Absolutely. I think what we're seeing in the first few months of this war are glimpses into potentially what future conflict could look like, and how the internet, how cyberspace has fundamentally changed the face of conflict. And like you said, when we used to think about war, we think about guns and missiles and tanks. We don't think about electrons. But the fact is that electrons are really impacting how this war is turning out. And it used to be the case that there were things that only governments could do and capabilities that only governments could provide. But the internet changes all of that, because so much of it is in private hands. There are so many capabilities that are in private hands. And I've worked for a few companies that have provided those capabilities to the US government. But now they're providing it to the Ukrainian government. So a great example of it was, coordinated with the original, as Russia went into Ukraine, they attacked Viasat. They took out the communications, which was so critical for Ukraine. And so Elon Musk steps in and provides Starlink, which is a much more distributed and much more resilient satellite communication system for the Ukrainians. I mean, that's something really new, and that was, he was able to step in and do that pretty fast. Geospatial imagery has been critical for targeting capability for Ukraine. We have some incredible satellite companies in the US. Some of them are, traditional systems integrators that we're well aware of, but some of them are startups. And they are providing, with permission from the US government, they're providing satellite targeting imagery to the Ukrainians so that they can be very precise in terms of what they do. So I do think we're seeing that war capabilities are becoming increasingly privatized, decentralized, and distributed, and that changes the face of conflict.
So let me ask you to spend a minute more talking about the Viasat attack, because I think that there is, I think that a popular misconception that we've seen is that cyber war never happened in Ukraine. That because it didn't look like sort of the nightmare scenarios of, electricity getting shut off, gas getting shut off, cities dark for months at a time, that we didn't actually see cyber play a major role on the infrastructure side. But removed from the context of our worst nightmares, Viasat is actually would stand as one of the most significant attacks we've ever seen against critical infrastructure. And I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I do think it's a misconception that cyber isn't playing a big role in this conflict. It is, for the most part, limited to the theater of conflict, and that's very different than what activities we've seen the Russians engage in before. As Chris said, there's been spillover effect of past Russian activity, including against Ukraine. Viasat was, so as you think about satellites, and this is, there's been a few things that we now realize we really have to pay attention to. So we think about satellites as controlling, GPS type stuff, but they're critical to all sorts of critical infrastructure functions, right? Banking transactions, agriculture, energy, and it's the communications that are the backbone of all that critical infrastructure. A lot of it happens through satellites, and we haven't really thought about security of satellites. Military communications also happens through satellites. What was interesting about Viasat is, again, that was coordinated with the initial insertion into Ukraine to take out the communications network. It had spillover effect. It impacted European customers, and it impacted wind farms in Germany. It took out the communications for those wind farms. So there was spillover effect. It didn't impact our military communications. It's actually a really interesting question as you think about it. Viasat is an American company. It was attacked by Russia. The impact was pretty limited to the theater of war. But if there had been spillover effect from that attack to US military communications, for example, what would that have meant from an escalation perspective? These are the questions and the complexities that this war is highlighting for us that we're unprepared for.
I want to come back and talk more about escalation risk in a minute, but Amy, you are sort of one of our best national observers of the intelligence community. And I wonder if you could talk about the role that US intelligence has actually played in the battle in Ukraine. And the merging of the sort of information operations and kinetic operations.
Sure. Well, first, thanks, Garrett, for bringing this cyber crew together, and thanks for all of you for taking time away from January 6th to hear about scary things in cyberspace. Cyber conflict is fundamentally an intelligence contest, and you can't divorce the intelligence component from the cyber component. And I think one of the big surprises in what the cyber threat looks like over the past decade is we now know it's not just hacking machines, it's hacking our minds. We learned that lesson first in 2016. I think that's the Sputnik moment for information warfare also. The one part of that Russian operation we know the intelligence community missed it completely, was the weaponization of social media, turning Americans against ourselves, influencing how we think and polarizing our society. For the first time, I think the big surprise in Ukraine is this is the first time we've been playing offense in terms of information warfare. So we saw unprecedented declassification of intelligence in the run-up to the war, led by CIA Director Bill Burns. Unprecedented in its persistence, in its granularity, in its specificity, and it turned out to be right.
And speed.
And speed.
Yeah.
And so this is an unnatural act for intelligence agencies because they always want to protect their sources and methods and continue to collect rather than reveal. So why did the Biden administration do it? And I think it was a brilliant move and probably a paradigm shift in the use of intelligence in information warfare. I think, this is my hypothesis, I think there are three reasons. Number one, when truth gets out of the gate first, it's harder to believe the lie. Sequencing matters. And so in this case, what the Biden administration said was, don't believe the con the Kremlin's about to try to do, right? Don't believe the lies. Putin says he's not going to invade. He's going to invade. And so the truth got out first, and that helped rally the allies. I think it helped convince the public in the United States as well. And oh, by the way, Russian citizens had access to the internet before the war too. So they know what American intelligence said, and they know that their own leader lied about what he was going to do. Second thing I think it did was that it imposed friction. So one of, I think, the real benefits of the new, relatively new cyber strategy, this defend forward strategy, is you want to impose friction on your adversary. You want to make it harder for them to operate. And so Putin's a former KGB guy, and so the more he is wondering, how do the Americans and the allies know this, the more he's stewing in his juices about he can't trust anybody, he can't trust his own systems, that's good for us. It puts him on his back foot. And then the third possible goal, I think, in declassifying all this information with information warfare, it makes it hard for third-party countries to stay on the sidelines. You gotta take a side. It's caused a lot more heartburn in Beijing, for example. You can't sort of play it both ways easily. And so it's imposing costs on third-party countries because the truth is out there. And we've made it very clear with the declassification of intelligence. So I think this is the beginning of a new era of information warfare.
There's a couple things that were super interesting, right? Because even Zelensky was telling us to stop talking about Russia invading Ukraine. No, people were so skeptical as we were declassifying this information, which was incredibly stunning. And his approval rating before the invasion was 26%. His approval rating after the invasion was over 90%. So the impact of these intelligence disclosures, which I agree with you, is a stunning change in policy, and it is the right change in policy, has been a determinative factor.
I do wonder on the Zelensky piece, having just gone through the collapse of Afghanistan, how much they were trying to avoid the cut and run. No, everybody stay here. Let's keep our people here. Zelensky, there was one theory that Zelensky would go to Munich for the Munich Security Conference and stay there, and the Russians would invade as soon as he left Ukrainian airspace. I think there's also a corollary to your second point about getting into Putin's head, and the benefit or the cascading impact it had on freezing the invasion. So it actually delayed their invasion potentially by a week or so, which kept the Russian forces on the border of Ukraine, burning through stocks. Their soldiers were getting absolutely wasted every night, terrorizing the people. So, not really good morale or relations, and they were selling off fuel. And so when you saw them actually invade, they ran out of fuel. They had terrible morale, and people were walking off the job effectively, and they ran out of food. So this shows you that sunlight is the best disinfectant works here, and it's almost a return to some of the counter-Soviet programs that we used to have, particularly at the State Department.
But by the way, the point on Xi shouldn't be lost because China is watching what we're doing. They watched what we did in Afghanistan. Wouldn't make you have a lot of faith in U.S. government's ability. And now they're watching what we're doing in Ukraine and how we're playing our hand and what kind of player we intend to be on the global stage. And it will have an impact on their thoughts with respect to Taiwan.
Neil, you had mentioned in your earlier answer the challenge of escalation risk, which is unique in some ways in cyber because of problems of attribution, problems of spillover. What have we learned about how conflicts escalate or won't escalate in this new age?
I think what you're seeing is all the players here very much trying to manage escalation risk. And as worried as we were about Russia sort of attacking U.S. critical infrastructure as part of its war in Ukraine, the truth is that Putin has very little interest in pulling the U.S. completely into this conflict. So to me, it's not a surprise that we haven't had attacks yet on U.S. critical infrastructure. The truth about Putin is he's lethal. And he can be unpredictable. So, we can sit here today not being surprised in the early days. Whether that continues in the future is an unknown. And I think one of the realities of cyberspace is speed and agility matter, and things can change really fast. So there used to be a time when you could sort of have relatively reliable predictions about how things were going to turn out. Today, it's all about conditional probabilities for anyone who's a poker player here. Every card that's dealt, every move that's made changes the possibility of what the next move is going to be. And you've got to be on your toes about it.
There's a part there, though, that one of the risks I think we have, and Amy is an intelligence observer, as Garrett put it, you probably can speak to this better than I can, but there's a risk of mirror bias. So mirror bias is a thing where you look at your adversary and you assume they view escalation the exact same way you do. So if you take a step, they're going to respond like you would. And that is absolutely not how Russia and Putin works. And my great concern is that as we continue to lever up pressure through economic sanctions, we're now going to put another air defense system into Ukraine. And as they start running out of the cannon fodder from Siberia and the Caucasus region, you actually have to put ethnic Russians into the fight in Ukraine, and they start coming home in pine boxes, the pressures are going to change on the Kremlin, and that's where I do worry about the answer to the question, is Putin a rational actor?
So I do think, the most dangerous moment of escalation risk is yet to come. So Putin can't afford to win this war, and he can't afford to lose this war. So how do we find a way to thread that needle? We have cognitive biases at play. I think it was optimism bias that led Zelensky to say, U.S. intelligence is wrong. I know more about what's going on in my country than President Biden does. He didn't want it to be true. There's mirror imaging going on too, what Chris is referring to. And of course, as a political scientist, I can't talk without mentioning the Cuban Missile Crisis, because they don't give you a PhD unless you actually talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. What did we learn from that eyeball-to-eyeball moment? Miscalculation was everywhere. There were many moments in that crisis with both sides trying to carefully manage that moment. Both leaders, Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy, carefully trying to manage that moment. Several instances during that crisis where we could easily have had nuclear war erupt because of accidents, because of miscalculation. Pilots erroneously flying over Soviet airspace really happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Intercepted by Soviet fighters, they had nuclear missiles on their airplane and authority to launch. There, but for the grace of God, was that crisis averted. So I think we need to be very careful about when we talk about escalation, we're not just talking cyber escalation, we're talking about chemical escalation, and we're talking about nuclear escalation. Russian nuclear doctrine is called escalate to de-escalate. Their doctrine calls for deploying low-yield battlefield tactical nuclear weapons to force another side to back down. So all of these things, I think you're exactly right, Nilu. This is a moment of unprecedented complexity. We are a hair's breadth away from a missile landing in Poland, or from a cyber attack potentially triggering Article 5 of NATO. An attack on one is an attack on all. And so the danger is really not deliberate escalation, it's inadvertent escalation and miscalculation.
Well, Chris, one of the things that makes Russia unique as a foreign adversary is the blending of their official and unofficial cyber threats to the United States, and the way that transnational organized crime groups operate with impunity there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the arc of ransomware as we have seen it over the course of the last 2 years, and sort of how that has played and not played a role specifically in Ukraine over the last couple of months.
So ransomware, cybercrime is not a new thing. It's not just like the last 2 or 3 years. It's been around for decades, right? What's changed in the last 5 to 6 years is that the bad guys have figured out how to monetize vulnerable and misconfigured systems at scale. So they've automated all of the scanning, looking for opportunities to hack. And then through the availability of cryptocurrency, which allows them to extract value outside of the eyes of the fiat economy, so the traditional regulated economy, they can hit big. I mean, there were some jobs last year that were 40 million plus in terms of ransoms. I mean, it's crazy. And then you have an insurance industry and others that are incentivized to get back up and running rather than have to deal with downside and perhaps loss of business. This has all blossomed in Russia under the eye of Putin and the FSB. The FSB is their generally domestic intelligence security service. And really, just like, if you're going to do business in China, you're only as successful as China's going to let you be. Same thing kind of goes for Russia. If you're a criminal in Russia, you operate at the whims and the guidance of the security services. And so over the last several years, a number of different cyber criminal organizations have really developed. And my theory was that ultimately there were 3 reasons. 3 reasons why the Kremlin allowed it. First was that it actually developed a cyber strategic workforce, something that we struggle with here, cybersecurity workforce. They have had on-the-job training, real-time, on-network, all over the world, that they could call on down the road. And that's probably happening right now. The security services are probably enlisting the cyber criminals to help them do their dirty work. The second reason is that it brought in revenue. It allowed them to bring in money from outside of Russia sources, tax-free. And it was a really good source of income and revenue, particularly for 20-year-olds and 30s. And then the last thing is aligned with the strategic objectives of the Kremlin in that it was destabilizing on the West. It forced a G7 meeting in Cornwall last summer. It forced a summit between Biden and Putin last year in Geneva. And that shows you that it has a strategic effect. So how has it been used? It's not clear exactly how it's been used in the Ukrainian activity just yet. It does look like there's been a bit of a pullback, at least of being able to convert or extort from U.S. businesses, in part because of sanctions on some of the exchanges and other ways. In fact, there was a great line at the RSA conference, which is the largest cyber conference in the U.S. a couple weeks ago, where a senior NSA official, Rob Joyce, posited that some of the ransomware actors had some difficulties getting money. And everybody's like, oh, how do you have evidence for that? And he goes, really? I'm the NSA. I saw it. So, we are having an impact, but I think cybercrime generally, now that it's this massive active ecosystem, it continues to have a gravity well that's pulling more participants in. It's just shifting, right? It's still happening, and it's building up elsewhere. Neela, you made the point earlier, last night at least, that Costa Rica had to declare a state of emergency because of a Russian cyber ransomware attack a couple weeks, a month ago.
What was interesting about that, right, this is the Conti ransomware group, which is one of the Russian ransomware groups that came out in favor of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and said they would go after any of Russia's enemies. Costa Rica, of course, came out against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they were hit by Conti with this, it's a tremendous attack that essentially took down all government services in Costa Rica, and they're still trying to recover from it. But what's also interesting is, like you said, crime and espionage are tools that our adversaries use as part of global strategic competition. And they have a somewhat unified approach to crime, espionage, and war. It's all about promoting their end goals. In the United States, we don't do that. We don't view crime, espionage, and war in the same way. We don't have a unified approach to it. And crime is starting to become a national security issue. Ransomware is becoming a national security issue. And as it becomes a national security issue, then we can have a military response to it. But until it's a national security threat, we don't go after criminals with the military until they pose a national security threat. That was true in the drug wars, and it's becoming true with cybercrime.
I can tell you exactly when that flip was switched. I was in the room. 2019, my team in preparation for the 2020 election was working through a number of scenarios about how the Russians or anyone else really could disrupt the election. And as we were just working through some scenarios, we were saying, like, well, what if a ransomware actor hit a voter registration database in September of 2020, which is a critical point in election planning. So you're really starting to wrap up voter registration, you're starting to design and populate ballots, and you want to start sending them out, particularly the mail-in ballots, and to military voters overseas. There's this critical moment where you can be highly disruptive. So we made that case to the intelligence community, and it was almost like a light went on. And it was like, oh, okay, we got it now. And so there was a shift, but it was in the broader context of election security as national security, and then you can step it down to cyber crime can also have significant national security implications.
And we saw very explicitly General Nakasone, the head of the NSA and Cyber Command, talk publicly about this sort of evolution last year of him starting the year being like, ransomware groups are not a target for Cyber Command, which is the military arm of our cyber operations, and then by the end of the year that we'd actually engaged in offensive cyber operations against ransomware groups.
But to Nilu's point, we really have to continue to think through what's the most practical and efficient and effective use of military resources. It is not necessarily a good thing where we use our military resources against criminals. You know, we have a finite set, and we need to focus them where. So focus them where they can be most impactful. But right now, it is probably in that space, because that's what the average American is feeling right now. It's cyber crime. It is ransomware. It is not the highest order bit in the security services at Russia and from Russia or China.
But that raises a broader conceptual issue, right? Which is, what is cyber war, right? And we had this in our sort of back and forth. And one of the conceptual challenges, we think that cyber war is something big, and that it involves militaries, and we know it when we see it. But what we've been talking about is cyber war is actually the accumulation of very small acts, and small things add up, whether it's ransomware or whether it's China's massive theft of intellectual property. So we've been in cyber war with China for years, right? China has stolen generations of technologies. The military officials have said there isn't a major weapon system in China that isn't based on stolen American technology. And so this is a fundamental shift in thinking that these small acts, these small breaches, pinpointed ransomware attacks, for example, can accumulate and have big strategic impact on our national security.
Well, let's open it up to questions here. And we've got mics on the side, and we'll start right down here.
So I want to go to the title of today's panel and ask the panelists the following question. Do you see a world war with just cyber infrastructure attacks, U.S. versus Russia, U.S. versus China, China versus U.S., or do you see that as just part of a more global war that could occur, let's say, as a result of China invading Taiwan? Do you think it could occur separately? I mean, I know it could, but do you think it's likely, or do you think it would only be part of a broader conflict?
To the extent that cyber war sits on its own, as Amy said, it's been happening. So this is the world we live in right now, is a world where cyber war is happening continuously. But if you talk about real conflict, we are going to war with another country. Cyber is an element. It's a tool that can be used. It's specific weapons that can be used in very specific ways, just like we wouldn't talk about just having a naval war or just an air war or just a ground war. It's one of the tools and domains that can be used in war. So I don't think there's a world where the only thing that's happening is somehow we're massively destroying each other's infrastructure through cyber means with no kinetic effect that somehow follows.
Let me sort of follow that up and ask both Amy and Chris. Why didn't we see more cyber attacks in Ukraine? How much of this is a question that if you're okay bombing something, it's actually just much easier to bomb something than it is to try to knock it offline from a cyber perspective? How much of this is Russia was sort of unprepared itself for cyber attacks against Ukraine? Like, why didn't we see, what we've imagined as the worst case scenarios in Ukraine?
So and this is like the big debate in the cybersecurity community. Don't you wish you were in it? But there's this debate. It's like, oh, there's massive cyber war. No, there was no cyber war. I mean, the truth is, it was always kind of in the middle, and it's kind of a muddy middle ground. I think the way I see it is there was not a single strategic objective of the Russians that was achieved through pure cyber. They did not take Mariupol using cyber and cyber alone. Bucha was not accomplished through cyber. Yet there were constant and continuous shaping activities, and that's really, as I see it, the best. And to your point about cyber, is really just an intelligence tool. It's you're trying to change the behaviors of your adversary. And so there have been time and time again destructive attacks, denial of service attacks. I think to your point about big, massive cyber war, the way I see it is, and there's a great, it's called Useful Fiction, but Ghost Fleet by Peter Singer, that talks about how, in a fictional context, how a Russian or Chinese invasion would use cyber attacks up front, to change the decision calculus of American leadership. I think we could still see that happen, again, as things deteriorate in Russia. You could see a hit on infrastructure, like a water system in a large metropolitan area, take it offline for 7 days. Water in a large metropolitan area offline for 7 days would lead to significant civil unrest, and that's my take at least. And so that's, I think, where you would see the most useful the most effective application. But to Garrett's point, right, it's like, if you're, or to Nilo's point, if you're already shooting missiles and firing bullets and you want to take out a TV station, you're just going to bomb the tower. You're not going to launch a cyber attack that you could just reflash a server and bring it back up in 2 days.
Yeah, so I was surprised too. I thought there would be much more cyber activity on the Russians' part going into Ukraine than what we saw. So this is an ongoing debate. It's actually quite an interesting debate, I think, Chris. But so I think on the one hand, Putin didn't do as much as we thought he would do. Why? Well, one possibility is you don't want to use a cyber weapon and lose it. It's not like an F-16 where you fly it over and you can use it again. Once you reveal your malware, the rest of the world knows about it and can turn it against you or defend against it much better. So you want to hold those weapons in reserve if you can. And we know that Putin thought this invasion was going to be fast. Right? Troops went with food for 5 days, and they brought their dress uniforms for the victory parade. So we know he miscalculated badly about his own military capabilities, about Ukraine's capabilities, and about the West's resolve in defending Ukraine or helping Ukraine to defend itself. So he didn't do as much as we thought. But there's also more information coming out that he did more than we might have thought he did. Right. And so General Nakasone has made some public remarks over the past several months, very clearly stating that United States Cyber Command was helping defend Ukraine's networks long before the invasion happened. We see a lot more information coming out. There was a report last week that came out from Microsoft about how Ukraine distributed its data and its capabilities a week before the invasion. So defenses actually played a major role in thwarting a lot of Putin's cyber activities. But one area where he's continued to operate, and Nilo and Chris have both mentioned this, is the information warfare battle space. So he is seeding the terrain with alternative narratives. You might have read about the US-Ukrainian biolabs in Ukraine, a total fiction perpetrated by the Kremlin. That continues, and that's directed outside of Ukraine, in the United States and more than 40 other countries around the world. So that continues.
The deviousness of the biolabs piece, though, is that it's actually part of the Nunn-Lugar program, where they're decontaminating Soviet-era biological and chemical weapons. So we're actually cleaning up a legacy of the Soviet Union, and they've turned it back around on us.
The growing digital asset space and blockchain space, what are the defensive but offensive opportunities that cyber can be used by the U.S. against illicit actors? And do you see that as an advantage given where we are in blockchain and the metaverse?
So, this is where I was on Bill Maher's show last year, and he asked me, what do you think about Bitcoin? And I made the same point I did earlier about cryptocurrency as one of the major enablers of ransomware. And my Twitter mentions were destroyed for a month. I mean, it's like the crypto bros came out, but not. The point here, though, is that I think one of the issues we're having is that even if it's a 2% stake of Bitcoin or whatever the cryptocurrency space is that's being used for illicit activities, it's still enabling significant societal harms. And so we have to find that right balance of where a completely distributed, decentralized model outside of the eyes of regulators, can that exist? Can we coexist in what we find an acceptable amount of societal harm, whatever that is? How do we bring that in? So I would expect to see more anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism type programs that will be instituted, particularly as larger financial institutions get onto the cryptocurrency and DeFi space, because they already have other obligations. So they'll want to kind of match the internal compliance programs they already have. And I think we will see, hopefully, some reduction of some of the bad behavior.
I think one thing I would add to that, Chris, is so much of the original premise / promise of crypto was it was this anonymous, untraceable currency. And it's turning out that that's actually just not true at all. And in fact, governments are actually getting quite good at tracing it. Andy Greenberg, my Wired colleague, has a book coming out later this year that's about basically like the Justice Department's learning how to trace Bitcoin and identify who the owners of wallets are downstream. And I think sort of one of the things that we are seeing rapidly unravel in the crypto space is the idea that this is, yes, it is much easier to extract the value, you know, from a ransomware target on the front end. It's a lot harder to try to use that value and have it that on the back end still be anonymous.
So just one additional point there, that if any of you sit on a board or your company, if you have an issue with ransomware and you make the decision to pay because you have to or for whatever reason, it is always in your advantage in this specific scenario to contact the FBI before you pay and work with them and provide them the forensic information on if you're making a payment, what wallets it's going to, so that they can trace it to get to Garrett's point of a potential outcome where they recover funds. So with the Colonial Pipeline, the big pipeline attack last year, I live in the DC area, lost, I couldn't get gas for like 3 or 4 days. But the FBI and others were able to recoup a good chunk of that money. Now, I think that's not necessarily great public policy to announce, like, hey, we can get your money back if you pay the criminals. Like, yeesh, that's probably not something we want to tell people.
It turned out they also had really bad security on their wallet.
Yes.
So,
yes.
The metaverse, by the way, I've been trying to sort of think about the metaverse from the perspective of a hacker or an adversary and what I would do in the metaverse if I had bad intentions. And all I can say to you is they know how to use social media platforms. So undoubtedly, they know how to use gaming platforms, frankly, for all sorts of ill effect. No doubt they will figure out how to use the metaverse.
And we've actually seen some, I think this might even be Amy's work from previous eras that I'm quoting, that we've seen actually terrorist groups using gaming servers for, chatting and organizing purposes.
Exactly.
So I want to take one more question, and then I have a wrap-up wrap-up question for the panel down here. Hold on, just one moment while the mic gets to you.
Thank you for your comments. Why don't we have a cyber police in this country?
You want to talk about your proposal to CISA?
Which one?
Well, that ties in well, actually, to the question that I was going to wrap up with. So let me sort of reframe that a little bit and let you answer that question in the context of what I was going to ask you guys to wrap up with, which is, what have we learned in the last 4 months, 5 months from Ukraine about what the US government needs to be doing differently, funding differently, organizing differently to combat what the realities of a cyber threat are actually turning out to be?
And so I think you have to sort of break cyber down into its component parts from that perspective, right? So you have destructive network attacks, and how do you protect against those? You have espionage, data theft, IP theft. How do you protect against those? And then you have information war. You have social media, being used by our adversaries very effectively at times. And by the way, also very effectively by Zelensky in the Ukraine war, so it can have positive impact as well. So how do you protect against the ill effects of those? And each of those has very different answers, I think. The way you protect against misinformation, disinformation is not by having a misinformation, by having a truth police that goes out there and does it. There's regulations that make a lot of sense. But that's very different than how you would protect against destructive network attacks or how you would protect against espionage. The reality is, at the end of the day, this has to be a public-private partnership. The private sector owns the infrastructure, owns the networks that have to be protected. They do not want the government coming in and protecting those networks for them. So we fundamentally need to have a different approach to this. that raises the cost on the adversaries.
To kind of on the nose answer your question, we do kind of. And so the FBI Cyber Division and then every FBI Cyber FBI field office has a cyber task force or some element, but it doesn't scale. I mean, we're talking a couple or a dozen people, but when you think about the amount of crime, cybercrime that's happening on a regular basis, identity theft, fraud across credit cards, any broader sort of cybercrime, we don't have the resources, so we have to kind of rethink the model. Where I'm leaning, and this is less that the last 4 months or so have been the test bed for where we need to go, but we kind of have this problem, at least in the U.S., where we are constantly focused on putting out today's fires. We have to be thinking about 5, 6, 7 years in the future, and we just don't. Rob Portman, Senator Portman from Ohio, was over there. He's unfortunately leaving the Senate, but he was one of those that could think a little bit more forward, a couple years or so. Think back to 1938-39, FDR was given the authority to reframe and restructure the federal government. We're in that exact same moment right now. The way technology has changed around us, the digital transformation, the dependencies we have to fundamentally rethink the way we interact as a government, as a population, with technology. We are not equipped. The Department of Homeland Security right now should not be the lead civilian cyber defense. There has to be something bigger that's more engaging, that's a digital, like a U.S. digital agency. Same thing goes, we didn't even really talk about it. We touched on it with the gaming platforms. One of the largest problems we have right now are trust and safety issues. Everybody wants some sort of collaboration tool. Guess what? Unmoderated collaboration tools are the cesspool of the internet. So we have to fundamentally rethink the way we use technologies, we interact with technologies within the appropriate framing of the Constitution, the First Amendment, civil rights, and civil liberties.
Amy.
I think this is a crucial question and a crucial organizational challenge. So if you have a burglar in your neighborhood, you call the police. If you have a foreign threat, we call the military. If you've got a problem on your computer, who do you call? It depends. Sometimes you call the FBI, that's usually after the fact, right? Doesn't help you prevent. You can, CISA, you do heroes work at CISA, but I looked and there are 2,800 employees at CISA.
Doesn't scale.
There are 10 times more people employed by the National Park Service protecting our vacation destinations than the crucial organization protecting our computer systems. So I think this is a 9/10, September 10th moment in terms of organization of our federal government. We're going to look back 20 years from now and we're going to say, how could we possibly have been organized this way given the gravity of the cyber threats that this nation confronts? We've made a lot of progress in the past several years. I think CISA was a crucial innovation. We have now the first ever national cyber director mandated by Congress. He's doing the first ever national cyber strategy. We have U.S. Cyber Command. We have the first ever deputy national security advisor for cyber and emerging technology. These are really important steps forward, but what we lack is this overall infrastructure of our federal government to make that private-public partnership work in a systematic way, instead of having it be reliant on people and their personalities and their personal relationships and a lot of hard work and good luck. So we have a lot more organizational reform ahead of us, and I hope we're going to see it.
Great. Thank you all. This was great.
Thank you.